You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 439 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I have a really great show today. I interviewed Scott Horton on the assassination of General Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Quds Force and an extremely important actor in Iran, Iraq, and the greater Middle East. Scott had a ton of good analysis in the interview. I just wanted to add that this is a rapidly developing story, so I went back and recorded a new intro to point out that we did record this show on the evening of Friday, January 3rd, so if things happen over the weekend or in the coming week, some of the material may get dated pretty quick, but nonetheless, Scott's analysis, I think, is going to be very consistent. And on the show, we also go over quite a bit of the relevant history of the Iraq War, and Scott debunks some of the claims made by the Trump administration, like Soleimani's responsible for the death of hundreds of Americans, and we have Mike Pence on Twitter that Iran was involved in 9/11. So really great show today. Everybody go to the Libertarian Institute to check out, my work and Scott's work. He's the guy that runs the thing, and I'm the news editor there. My show and Scott's show are both featured on the homepage, as well as the daily news roundup that I write. So thanks so much for tuning in and taking the time to share the show. And here's the interview. All right, everybody, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. On today's show, I have Scott Horton returning. You all know Scott. He runs the Libertarian Institute. He's the editorial director of antiwar.com, host of the Scott Horton Show, 5,000 interviews over there. And they're all free, by the way, which is a pretty cool thing. He just has free archives. Some people start charging for theirs. And then also he is the author of Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and his latest book, the Ron Paul Interviews. So, Scott, welcome back to the show.
Thanks very much, Kyle.
All right, Scott, big topic on today's show. Everybody is really talking about the assassination of the head of the Iranian Quds Force at the Baghdad airport, Soleimani there. So, man, I guess, maybe start off just a little bit by saying, how big of an event is this? Because it's certainly, catching a lot more attention than the death of, some Middle Eastern general of, any other nation or stature.
Mm-hmm. Well, I saw him on Fox News today saying, this is a way worse guy than Osama bin Laden or Zawahiri of Al-Qaeda, which is just crazy and wrong. I mean, those guys killed 3,000 Americans. They were the worst part of the Sunni insurgency that the bin Ladenites were, that killed 4,000 Americans during Iraq War II. And they want to pretend that, first of all, anytime a Shiite killed an American during Iraq War II, then that Shiite Arab Iraqi all of a sudden magically, by the property of their BS claims, becomes an Iranian and an agent directly of this guy. And then by their same math, the 500 or so Americans who did die at the hands of Shia in that war, the 500 becomes 600. And then 600 becomes greater than 4,000. And now somehow, and a lot of times just by omission, saw Jack Keane on Fox News this morning, he made it sound as though Iran was behind the insurgency. He didn't say the Sunni-based insurgency, because that might have raised questions, against the Americans during that war. And so, I don't know to what degree anybody believes this, really. It's just the talking point, and it's not just Fox. It's all over the place, but especially I've been watching Fox today, and they just repeat this over and over again, and it just becomes kind of gospel. A lot of times they don't explain what they mean by that. They don't elaborate any of the facts. They just go, Iran killed 600 Americans in the war. This guy Soleimani is the worst guy ever. So in terms of being, an opponent of the Americans, it's just not true. As we will get to, America fought Iraq War II for this guy. and to put his very best friends in power in Iraq. Now, as far as how big of a deal is it to the Iranians, I'm pretty sure it's everything. I'm pretty sure I think, this is the equivalent of if the Iranians had killed James Mattis or David Petraeus, or imagine if David Petraeus and James Mattis had actually won any wars and were actually really considered heroes, not just, PR commodities for the complex on TV. But what if people actually respected them?
Yeah, people have said something like the World War II generals like Eisenhower or Patton, who also had, political influence and were just generally popular people, among the country. Yeah,
absolutely. And so for America to, violently kill a guy like that, to them, will be huge. And I, without knowing the details, we can only speculate about this from what we know so far. But I think it's pretty much inescapable that the doves will be marginalized. Rouhani and all the people who push for the nuclear deal that Trump already ruined, and all of his allies are going to be on the receiving end of a million told you so's here, and the hawks are going to be ascendant. And I think, we got to rely on the cool, patient wisdom of the Ayatollah to not do something horrible. Well, he might not even have a choice. He's actually generally a pretty cool customer for an Ayatollah, I'd say. But he's going to have to do something. And, I talked with Patrick Coburn earlier today, and he was saying, there are plenty of Iraqis who've been fearing that there's going to be an American and Iranian proxy war in Iraq. It'd be better than a war against Iran for real. But we don't really have any forces in Iraq to have a war with Iran. I mean, if Iran has a proxy war with us in Iraq, they don't need to fire rockets at our bases or riot at our embassy or any of that stuff. All they need to do is make sure that the parliament throws us out and that they stick to their guns and tell us they don't need our help against ISIS anymore. They and their Iranian friends can handle it and boot us out that way. And so that would be the smart Iranian play here. Would not be violence. It would be politics, and really stick it to us in that way. By, it's a pro-Iranian government that America put in power there. And so I think that's what they could probably do. Meanwhile, America doesn't have enough force there to launch a war. And then what are they going to do? They're going to attack Baghdad? This conflict is with our allies. This conflict is with the guys that we fought Iraq War II and Iraq War III for. And so, our guys are there to help them fight ISIS right now. And it doesn't make much sense that our guys are going to be able to somehow turn around and take it to them. I mean, you could have a Dien Bien Phu type of situation real quick. We've only got 5,000 guys there. It's certainly enough force protection for dealing with the Sunni insurgency. But if, all their own clones turn on them, Order 66 style, their goose is cooked. So, I think they realize that. I don't know. I really don't know what they even have in mind to happen next. If the Iranians respond violently in this or that way, what do they think they're going to do? I really, would hate to predict. But I guess I do think, though, that the stakes are so high on both sides, not for anything they have to lose if they make peace, right? It's not like Trump is going to have to go ahead and let them get nuclear weapons. That's not an issue. They're not making nuclear weapons. It's not like, you know what I mean? It's not like Trump has to back down from any reasonable position. He only has to back down from his unreasonable ones. And otherwise, there's nothing to fight about. There's nothing to fight about. And so, and there's so much to lose. And the Iranians have a lot to lose. In the event of a real war with America, let's not kid ourselves. The USA can put firepower on targets and if it came to a country like Iran, a real war with a country like Iran, you're talking B-52 carpet bombing, Syria. They never did that one single day in Iraq or Afghanistan, sending the B-52s, like that. But they know that. They know that they would be up against the worst of what America has to offer, shock and awe to the nth degree. And yet the Americans know that part of ringing Iran with bases means that we've got a bunch of guys within range of their missiles. And so, America, essentially, our government has made our soldiers tripwires, otherwise known as hostages, all across the Middle East. And if they had to reach out and touch our guys in Kuwait, in Iraq, Bahrain, Qatar, in Afghanistan, and all kinds of economic targets up and down the western side of the Persian Gulf there, they could do that. And as we've seen over last summer with, I don't know exactly what happened with those acts. Some of it seemed kind of fake. I'm sure you heard when I interviewed Elijah Magnier, he said he talked to the Iranian Quds Force guys. And they said, oh, the bombs attached to those ships? You shouldn't mess with us. Like, they didn't exactly claim responsibility, but they were happy to take credit, happy to have credit assigned to them. And the point being that we can blow up your $50 million ship for $1.75. And we can shut down oil trading in the Persian Gulf in an afternoon for, $6.50. So don't mess with us. And then what did Trump do? He didn't mess with them. Trump said, well, they shot down a drone and drones don't really have feelings so much. I don't think, right? Somebody got in his ear and said, hey, instead of making everything worse, now would be a good time to back down. And he went with that. Thank goodness that time. So I don't know, man. I'm not predicting the worst here. I'm worried about what the Iranian reaction is going to be and then the American reaction from there. But I'm not expecting the worst, I guess.
Right. Well, I like that tape because you're trying not to be too alarmist, but there is this very difficult reality that they have, for the Iranians. Just imagine if, again, it was like an American general that was, even if it was Mattis and not somebody with the popularity of Soleimani, what the, demand for violence, among the American people would be. The American right would be screaming right now if Trump, wasn't bombing Iran. And so I guess, realizing that Iranian politicians and leadership probably have to deal with some of that hawkishness. And Of course, I want to bring up the show you did with Peter Van Buren because I think you guys had great analysis on that show. And I was actually just finished listening to it, hopped on Twitter, and that's when I first saw, the first kind of rumored report that the U.S. had killed Soleimani in Iraq. And I was kind of thinking to myself, well, this doesn't seem right. It seems like a huge escalation. So, what do you think? Do you think it's kind of the low simmering war maybe turned up just a little bit hotter that you and Peter Van Buren have been talking about? That's been going on for quite a while between the U.S. and Iran. This isn't anything, I guess, brand new. It's part of the same series of conflicts as before.
Yeah. Well, there really was a chance for a new beginning after the Iran nuclear deal, but Trump's policy since 2017 has been maximum pressure. And the idea there is not regime change, not a CIA coup and not a war, but just we're going to put them through such economic difficulty that they'll rise up and overthrow their government themselves for us, which of course never works. But that's essentially been the policy, maximum pressure. And so scotching the nuclear deal was part of that so that we could, reinstitute all the sanctions and all of that kind of thing. I'm sorry,
so even through the nuclear deal, it's not like the U.S. kind of wasn't waging this similar type of proxy war with Iran, the Quds Force in Syria that whole time with arming the Sunni resistance there, right? And then true. The Quds Force was backing Assad.
Right, which was, a major irony of the Obama years, that at the same time that he's making a nuclear deal with the Iranians over Saudi's dead body, he's helping the Saudis fight against Iranian interests in Syria and Yemen to deadly effect, right, to the tune of the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in both countries. So now as far as the, whether this is meant to really escalate the conflict, I think not. I think Trump really did this to be the last word. Right. It was meant to be, don't you mess with me. I'm so, don't you know I'm loco kind of thing. And so he goes ahead and kills their number one guy, the Ayatollah's number one get her done dude, and in his thinking, as he put it in his talk today, he said, I'm not trying to start a war here. I'm trying to stop one. And I think that he means that. I'm not giving him credit. I'm not saying it's okay or anything like that, but I'm just saying I think that that's honest, that what he was trying to do was say, don't you mess with me. And hoping that the Iranians will do the smart thing and back down. And I don't think that that's a wisely calculated move at all, but I think that was the intention behind it. So, look, the reality is that you cannot achieve a regime change with air power. You could do a CIA coup if you really had everybody in place, but that's impossible in Iran now. This ain't 1953 there. They can't do that. They could carpet bomb Tehran. That would not change the regime. It would kill a lot of people, maybe a lot of military, but it wouldn't completely destroy the state. To win the war, you need boots on the ground. That's where that phrase comes from. It's not just fun or whatever it means. That's what it means to control territory. You have dudes standing there with M4s, literally holding the power in place through the barrel of a gun. And for America to achieve that in Persia would mean drafting a World War II sized army, right? It would mean stopping all business and taking the fighting age males out of productive activity in America and sending them off to Persia to fight in the mountains, or a desert or some horrible place where they don't belong. And the Army and the Marine Corps have no interest whatsoever in doing that. There was a time, at least, and this may still be true, I don't know, but there was a time, say 10 years ago, when the Air Force liked to talk real tough about how we can do it. And of course, the Navy, they're expert in air power as well. And they've been literally launching combat sorties from the decks of aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf for 29 years now, without stopping. And I think they know from that experience that Iran is too much to chew for them to bite off, and that they don't want to do it. I'm sure they're, probably more confident than they should be about their ability to destroy Iran's Navy in a day and whatever. But there's a lot of anti-aircraft, capability. Iran is not Iraq. And so the Marines and the Army, they don't want to die trying to occupy the place. They wouldn't dream of it. And, the Navy is at best, half-hearted, probably less than that, about their ability to achieve their goals there. And I'm sure the Air Force guys have got to recognize their limitations as well when it comes to really being effective. So, I don't want to speculate too much here, whatever. I guess I should get Mark Perry on the phone and figure out what they're saying down at the Pentagon. But in my experience this whole time, all I've ever heard is that the military men don't want a real war with Iran. They know what they have to lose. They know how difficult it would be. It would be a real war, not like Iraq. The Iraq war, the war against the Iraqi army lasted 2.5 weeks. That's not a real war. The occupation was a nightmare. The civil war that broke out between, essentially civilian militiamen, backed by the U.S. on one side and Al-Qaeda suicide bombers and Saudi money on the other. That was a catastrophe, but it's not quite the same as meeting the Wehrmacht in the field, that kind of thing. But a war with Iran would be a real war compared to Iraq War II. So, in other words, it's unthinkable. It doesn't make it impossible, but it means that all sober adults in power in D.C. know that we can't ever let it go that far. They don't need nukes. They don't need a nuclear deterrent. They just need to be as big a country as they are. And actually, frankly, their government is run by some mean SOBs. Soleimani, he makes a great devil figure. He sure looks the part of a mean, merciless, crafty, throat-slitting guy who gets business done. And their government is made up of guys like that, murderers who get things done. Doesn't make them different than our government, just smaller, not more cruel, not really, but they, as cruel.
Right. And well, I guess part of it is that, recently they fought a war against the Islamic State. So, there's a lot of cruelty going on among the Shia side, but the guy still gets to be a hero because, he was fighting people who were, doing medieval torturing and, the most cartoonish evil figures they could possibly be, for the sake of kind of fitting that portrayal. I guess to drive recruits, but that's what this guy's. So, that's why I guess he was kind of celebrated as a hero for a time. But as you point out, the guy is also a cruel SOB. I've seen people say that he's behind the crackdown on protest, of the Iraqi protesters pretty recently. But even if he's not directly responsible for that, certainly those type of actions, of Shia doing cruel things, armed Shia militants doing cruel things across the Middle East are probably, responsible, this guy's orders.
Yeah. So that's the thing about it, man, is, to make it not so personal about Soleimani. And I don't know about his role in the current, domestic, protest crackdown there. But, as much defending of Iran as I do, because I don't like lies, and they never were making nukes. And, the vast majority of the complaints about, for example, their role in fighting Americans in Iraq War II is just blown completely out of proportion. But the worst thing that they ever did in this century was really, really bad. And that was to take the full advantage that they did of George Bush's Iraq War II. And when George Bush invaded that country, the people who came to say, hey, we're at your service, we'll be your new majority democracy, and we like you, those factions were essentially backed by Iran. It was the Supreme Islamic Council, Abdul Aziz al-Hakim, and then in his alliance with the Dawa Party. And the Iranians had told them, standing orders, get along with the Americans, do whatever they say, make friends with them, inherit the power, get the power. And then they did. And their policy was, and you could ask Muqtada al-Sadr. Muqtada al-Sadr would routinely denounce Skiri and Dawa, his allies in the United Iraqi Alliance, the new supermajority Shiite political alliance that was writing the constitution and inheriting all of the power after the election of 2005. All of the prime ministers, 3 of them in a row, Jafari, Maliki, Abadi, and then Abadi. Those were all Dawa Party guys. And then the most recent one, Ahmadi, was from Skiri. So the two major pro-American, or American was pro-them anyway, and the Iranians were pro-them too, factions. And Sadr would denounce them for being too pro-Iranian. He would say, we want the Americans out and we want the Iranians out too. And not just, we don't like them here, but he hated their policy. And their policy was this Shiite chauvinism, essentially. And look at it from the Iranians' point of view. It makes total sense. If your best friends in the supermajority are taking over the country there, why try to conquer all of the west of the country where all the Sunnis live? All the oil's down in the south in almost totally Shiite territory, and up near Kirkuk, where it's a question of whether it's the Shiites or the Kurds who control it, not the Sunni Arabs there either. So why compromise with them? Why deal with them? Why go through the effort? Instead, we can just kill a few 100,000 of them, kicking them out of the capital city. And then we'll have Iraqi Shiistan in alliance with Tehran. And we won't have to take responsibility for all those Sunnis. And we won't have to share any of the oil money with them either. So screw them. That's what they get for backing Saddam's dictatorship over the supermajority this whole time, was the thinking, on their part. And Sadr said, no, we're all Iraqis. We should be Iraqis and Arabs and Muslims before we're Sunnis and Shias, and we should work together on this against America and Iran. So what did America do? America sided with Dawa and Skiri, the same guys that Iran was supporting. We supported the most pro-Iran factions against the nationalists because he was against us too. But what they did, and Sadr did play his role in this eventually. He's not innocent of this at all. Once the Civil War was on and the policy, was America is backing these Shiite militias to hunt down and kill the leaders of the Sunni insurgency. And then that, devolved, the whole thing, turned into this horrible civil war. Then Sadr and his men did their part working with the Americans and with the Badr Brigade to kick all those Sunnis out of Baghdad. And, fought a civil war that did kill upwards of 1 million people anyway, if not more than 1 million. And And so it was that was Iran's policy. Dawa and Skiri's policy was what Iran had dictated to them. And it was as bad as America's role, as bad as Al-Qaeda's role in that war. You know, those were the three major factions ruining everything for everyone.
Right. Well, at some point, you know, here during the Iraq War, Scott, the Americans went under the Redirection, the great article you always talk about by Seymour Hersh. I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes page. But after that, eventually the U.S. ended up fighting some Shia. And so now every time, you know, somebody in the Trump administration or somebody supporting military action against Iran is talking, they always say, oh, it's so great that this Soleimani guy is dead because he is guilty for killing hundreds of American soldiers. So is he responsible for the you know, Shia that were fighting against the Americans and the people that were killed in that fighting?
No. Again, America was backing the same factions the Iranians were backing. It was Sadr, the nationalists, that they were cracking down on when the Americans turned on the Shia. They tried to kill him so many times, he actually fled to Iran and got a higher religious rank while he was there and became closer to Iran while he was there, inevitably. But to say the way they claimed in 2007 and 8 that who's Dawa, who's Scary? No. It's Sadr who is the Iranian cat's paw. And all of his efforts to resist America's occupation, that's Iran doing it. Now, the kernel of truth there was that Iran certainly was helping some of those militia groups that were fighting the Americans. There was a contest, essentially. Since America and Iran were both backing the same groups, once they had really solidified their power over the capital city, which of us was going to have the most influence with them on the permanent basis? It was sort of a race. And as we all know, the government that Bush put in power told him now, thanks a lot, don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out, and refused to allow him to keep a single base in the country, while, of course, maintaining their strong ties with the Iranians. And so once the Americans decided to target Sadr and the Mahdi army, did the Iranians help support the Shia resistance against that? Probably some. But what a line of, well, it's just false to say every time a Shiite killed an American, that was Iran killing that American in the war. That's just not true. And those were local Shiite fighters. They were Iraqis. They were Arabs. And the main, supposed fact underlying this narrative is that all of the EFP roadside bombs, the copper core new and improved IEDs that the Shia used against the Americans, that those all came from Iran. But that was just a lie, Kyle. They never proved that. And the reason why is because it wasn't true. Even if some of them had come from Iran, that was no proof that the Iranian government had sent them whatsoever. There's an arms trade in the region. No question about that. But even then, there's no reason to really believe that any of them came from Iran. Because, in fact, the technology came from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, who, yes, are allies with Iran, but they got the tech from the IRA and then shared it with the Iraqis from there. So the chain of how to make them, all the knowledge and expertise and whatever, all of that did not come through Iran in the first place. And then the bombs were made in Iraq by Iraqis. It was never demonstrated, despite a million claims, including this week, but the same thing back in, this time 13 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. The line was, everybody knows that these bombs all come from Iran. It's just true because they claim it's true, and that's it. Like Trump's ties with Russia or Saddam's nuclear bombs or whatever it is. They just make their claim. And just like you can see on TV today, 500 troops, they killed 500 guys. They killed 500 of our guys. 600. Oh, yeah, 600. They killed 600 of our guys. You know what they did? That guy Soleimani, he killed almost 1,000 of our guys in the Iraq War with no mention whatsoever that war was fought by America for these guys. No mention that the guys we're fighting now, the groups we're attacking now, are the very ones that we put in power. I mean, did you see the news today that they had arrested after this drone attack on Soleimani, they arrested the leader of the Badr Brigade, which is the militia of the Supreme Islamic Council, Al-Hakim, the Al-Hakim group, the one major, leg of the United Iraqi Alliance that wrote the Constitution that we fought the whole war for. The most recent prime minister was from the Supreme Islamic Council. And this guy, Amiri, was his ally from, this is like the IRA and Sinn Féin. This is one group. And, the militant side of it and the politician side of it, I guess. And these are the guys that the Americans are after. And they're the very same ones that they put in power.
Well, it does just seem absurd. And that's why I like having you on to break this stuff down and to go through the facts and the details. Because when you hear somebody say things kind of vaguely like that, you're like, oh, well, there's been a lot of fighting going on in the region for a lot of time. So, and there's another one that they have like this, and that is that Iran was involved in 9/11, where they'll made some kind of vague claims about it, saying that, Iran released some people who turned out to be involved in the attack, or allowed some people to travel through Iran to Afghanistan, and this was how Iran was responsible for, or at least in part for the terrorist attack. But Scott, I know you know the truth on this one, and Mike Pence was tweeting this out, so I thought I'd let you take a chance to debunk this.
Yeah, it's a lie. And it's no mystery why all this stuff comes from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and those closest to the, neoconservatives and Likud party in Israel pushing this narrative. But the fact that Dick Cheney and George Bush and Richard Pearl and George Tenet and Condoleezza Rice didn't make a big deal about this back in 2001 might be your first clue that there's nothing to it at all. Talk about the dog that didn't bark here. Dick Cheney, never heard of this great information you guys got, huh? But anyway, the fact these guys had traveled through Iran, of course, means nothing. They'd traveled through Malaysia and Spain and Germany and 20 of the 50 states too. So what? Doesn't mean a thing. And the Army War College has a giant study that they did debunking this. And so did the New America Foundation back when Pompeo was still at CIA. He released through the FDD, he released this, tranche of documents supposedly showing that Al-Qaeda had this relationship with Iran, but they showed no such thing. And some of these were documents that had been seized from the raid on bin Laden. But they showed no such thing. They showed an antagonistic relationship. They showed exactly like we always knew all along, that all the Al-Qaeda guys that had fled to Iran after 9/11 and the American invasion of Afghanistan, they were all arrested and renditioned home, other than a very small number, or a relatively small number, of very highly valuable targets, including Hamza bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's terrorist son, not the one that gave the Rolling Stone interview, but the one that was killed recently, actually, and was, or supposedly at least, and was, said to be the heir apparent to the organization, as he was getting older, and including a guy named, I want to say it's Atef, but I think that I'm confusing him with a guy that was killed right after September 11th there. Maybe that was it, Atef. Anyway, there was this guy, you could find this. He was released, only in like 2013 or 14. He'd been held for years and years, and he was only released, and he was apparently like a pretty high leader in Al-Qaeda. And he was only released when the Taliban kidnapped an Iranian diplomat and then ransomed him and got a couple of Al-Qaeda guys freed so that the Iranians could get their diplomat back. But it was pure blackmail, right? Pure extortion. And, famously, should be more famously, the Iranians offered to give over all of these Al-Qaeda guys, including bin Laden's son, to George Bush and Dick Cheney in 2003. And not only did they reject the deal, but they sat there and ridiculed and slammed and trashed the Swiss ambassador who dared to bring the peace deal to the Americans. This was the golden offer where the Iranians said that they were willing to negotiate everything. We already helped you in Afghanistan. We've already been helping you against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now we're prepared to work with you to put the Dawa party in power in Baghdad. You want to get rid of Saddam Hussein? We want to get rid of Saddam Hussein. This was actually right after the war. You want, a peaceful transition of power in Iraq? Let us work with you on that. You want us to cut off Hamas and Hezbollah? We will definitely consider that. You want to talk about oil? We've got oil. And you've got oil companies. Maybe we can do some business. This was the entire theme. This was the golden offer. This was the Ayatollah Khamenei, and I'm almost certain at that time it was President Khatami saying, man, let's get this done. Let's figure out how we can get along. Dick Cheney had complained during the Bill Clinton years about all the sanctions on Iran. He was the CEO of Halliburton. He wanted to do some business and said they're people too. And so the Iranians had every reason. They were shocked to be included in the axis of evil in George Bush's speech in 2002, when they had done everything, had already been working with the Bush administration on so many goals. Anyway, but when it comes to their support for September 11th or real support for Al-Qaeda, I think you'll find that Iran helped Bill Clinton arm Al-Qaeda in Bosnia in 1995. But that's about it. And, even this year, we saw in February, there's a massive attack against the Revolutionary Guard Corps by Al-Qaeda. In February, not this year anymore, it's changed. In February of 2019, there was a massive attack by Al-Qaeda. I'm not sure if that was the very most recent one or not. Of course, there are massive ISIS attacks against them since then. And, it's not the case that, Sunni, Shia, so therefore they can never, ever work together and that kind of thing. That's overly simple. Iran did back Hamas for many years, although they had their falling out over the war in Syria, where Hamas sided with the CIA and the Israelis and the Saudis and the Turks against the Syrian government that the Iranians backed. So they had their big split there. And like I said, they did help Bill Clinton arm bin Laden's forces in Bosnia. That's where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed earned his stripes and credibility as a terrorist leader, working for the CIA and the Americans then. And Iran helped send guns there. I don't think they did too much, but they, it was an Islamic cause, broadly speaking. And, bin Laden himself, in a lot of ways, Michael Scheuer pointed this out. He was a bit of an Arab nationalist. As Scheuer pointed out, he never complained about the treatment of the Kurds in Turkey. But they're Sunnis, and they're horribly oppressed by the Turks with the support of the Americans. And yet bin Laden never mentioned them. They're Sunnis and they're Muslims, but they're not really Arabs. But in fact, he would say, sympathetic things about the Shia. And I think it was really, the guy's pretty right-wing Sunni, don't get me wrong, but I think it was really Zarqawi who invented the, priority of sectarian war against the Shia in Iraq, which was really bad planning, because if you just look at the numbers, the Shia were the super majority, more than 60%. And so the Sunni minority, especially led by kooks like that, never had a chance once the real war got started there. And especially because the Shiites, again, had the Americans and the Iranians on their side. But anyway, it's simply a lie. If Iran had done 9/11, George Bush would have dropped an atom bomb on Tehran, which is also true if Saddam Hussein had done 9/11. I'd probably repeat myself too much about this, but I just love this story so much. Right before the war in 2003, I was arguing with a guy in my cab who was a successful, wealthy real estate guy with a good education and a lot of professionals in his peer group, kind of a guy. And he was just convinced that, of course, Iraq had done 9/11. And, it was a matter of social psychology, right? Like, he was a Republican. He was a successful, rich, white guy, businessman, and everyone else that he knew, like him, all supported the war. And so it's rationalization time, And so I remember him saying to me, look, if Iraq didn't do it, then why would we be attacking them then? And my response to that was, if Iraq did do it, how come we're having this conversation in the spring of 2003? We didn't ask the French and the Russians and the Chinese for permission on the UN Security Council to retaliate against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, did we? Why would we be asking the French for permission to defend ourselves. We're not. The reason you have to get a Security Council resolution is because the law is that it's a war crime to start a war unless you have a UN Security Council resolution. Not to defend yourself, to aggress. And by the way, you know, Afghanistan is the town of bedrock out there. There's no good targets out there. You take care, assuming they have the permission, you take care of bin Ladenites with Rangers and Green Berets and Delta Force and CIA Special Activities Division mercenary guys, and then that's it, you know? But if Iraq had been behind that attack on New York City and the Pentagon, George Bush, I don't know if he would have used the biggest H-bomb in the arsenal, but he would have dropped an atom bomb on Baghdad. That's how you know that Bush knew that Saddam Hussein was innocent. And if you don't buy that, then at least he would have carpet bombed him with B-52s for months. And he would have not stopped in New York City to ask the French if it was okay first.
Right.
And the same thing with Iran. If there was the slightest hint that Tehran had been behind that attack, you'd have had explosions, man. Huge explosions. Endless numbers of them. And those people would have been made to absolutely suffer back then. And the reason that they didn't do that is because it's not true that Iraq or Iran had anything to do with that attack. And for that matter, neither did the government of Yemen, neither did the government of Libya or Syria, neither did the government of Afghanistan have anything to do with that attack on the United States. They tried to warn us and were turned away.
Right. So, Scott, I know we're getting a little bit short on time here. I want to ask you one more question and give you a chance to talk about the matching funds over at the Libertarian Institute. But the last thing I want to ask is some people are saying that they think this may be the time the Iraqis, especially politically, push to get the Americans out of the country. I guess this happened before in 2011. So could it happen again? And, is it going to kind of repeat out like last time, where it's a status of forces agreement situation, or what do you see happening with that?
I hope that's what happens. And I think that would be the Iranians' best play, right? Would just be to use politics, not violence, and use all of their influence in the parliament to make the parliament make us get out. And then that's the best way to stick it to the U.S. state, but without killing anybody, without creating an excuse really for any further escalation. And yes, this is exactly what happened in 2008. I mean, the thing there was Bush was out of time. He couldn't run for a third term. It was, an election year, and he had to sign something. And Maliki just essentially shined him on. By the way, somebody, I can't remember if it was in email or on the Reddit group, or somebody was asking me about this. If you hear this, email me and I'll help you find the footnotes. But Patrick Coburn really did the best of reporting about all of this in 2008. And it was Bush wants 64 bases. And Maliki was like, you know what? Let me see what I can do. And I'll go ask the parliament what they think. And then he came back and he was like, yeah, they're not good with 64 bases. And Bush said, well, how about 50? I mean, you'll let me have 50 bases. And Maliki said, you know what? You guys wait right there. I'm going to go back and talk with the boys and see what we can do. And they just played that out. And they just did that over and over again all summer long and into the fall. And then finally, by the end of it, they told Bush, sorry, Charlie, I just can't get authorization for the status of forces agreement. Or for any bases in it. And so you're going to have to sign on the dotted line. The UN Security Council resolution for the occupation was expiring. And the only way to get the permission of the government to legalize the occupation and the continued presence of American forces there was no bases and no immunity for American soldiers who are accused of war crimes. They'll be subject to Iraqi courts. And so that was completely the deal killer. And so Bush signed on the dotted line and said, we'll be out by the end of 2011. The unthinkable. The pro-Iranian government that Bush installed in power preferred Iran to America. At the end of the day, they're closer to them than they are to us. Doesn't mean they want to be dominated by Iran, just better than the Americans. No matter how much money and weapons we have, they have real kinship there. And so they told Bush to go to hell. And then Obama, he did try. Now, maybe he didn't do a full court press 100%, But he did try to renew the SOFA and get permission to stay in 2011. And they just weren't having it. And then, in fact, one of the things that happened was the heroic Chelsea Manning's WikiLeaks revealed one particular atrocity by American soldiers who had murdered this family, lined them up and murdered them in their living room, including an infant, and then had called in an airstrike to cover it up. But the airstrike hit the wrong part of the house, and all the corpses survived. And so then they had to go into this huge cover-up of the dead bodies and all of this, just absolutely outrageous. Imagine if they had done that to us, executed an American baby at point-blank range, those Iraqi terrorist, demon, devil, swarthy-looking dudes. That was how they reacted. They were also upset. And so that really helped to undermine Obama's effort to keep the status of forces agreement going. And so they had to leave. And people want to say, oh, that was the worst thing ever. Well, it was the democracy that America installed in power that decided it. It was the parliament under a majority rule, legal, constitutional system that the USA invaded in the name of creating. So sort of up to them, right? Which, by the way, so this brings me to an important point, and I'm sorry, I know we're over time here, but Trump used to say in the campaign a few different times in the campaign, he very correctly said, Obama created ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS. And the liberals went nuts. The TV people went nuts. How could you say that? They didn't want to address the facts at all. They just said, what a mean thing to say. And then Trump said, look, he backed the terrorists in Libya. He backed the terrorists in Syria. And then when the Syrian terrorists came rolling into Iraq, he had pulled all the troops out. So they weren't there to keep them from sacking Mosul and all that. Well, that was all true, right? But then once he became president and, they excised Mike Flynn from his national security post there, he didn't have anyone to, refresh him on that talking point. And so the part about Obama backed the rise of ISIS in Syria. And that was what caused the creation of the Islamic State in Iraq. That was the most important part of that. He dropped that part of the story and ended up just with the standard rote safe haven myth type of an explanation that ISIS was caused by American withdrawal. And, Bush and Cheney love to say this too. It's amazing that they have the courage. They never displayed it before, but they have the courage to make the same claim that, I told you we can't leave. And it's funny because I've seen on Fox News, George W. Bush predicted this. What? He predicted that if he got rid of Saddam Hussein and sided with the Shia for 5 years in a war against the Sunnis and drove them into the arms of al-Qaeda and gave a bunch of bin Ladenites prominence in a secular society where they never existed before, that if we leave and then his successor backs those same terrorists in the country next door for 5 years, that then this could happen, huh? Is that what George Bush warned us? Oh, yeah. No, instead he said, well, we can't ever leave. And never mind anything that happened before or anything that happened since to make things the way that they are. And it's amazing. I never turn on TV, but I did yesterday and today just to see for late breaking stuff, anything really coming out in the moment I really needed to know. But it's just such garbage. And all of the just assertions. In junior college, I made some claim and I didn't prove it. And so I got an F on my paper. You don't get to just get up there and make a bunch of claims. You got to explain what you mean. You got to tell the story. You mentioned the redirection, for example. I try to cite as many footnotes as I possibly can so that people can understand all this stuff. I wasn't there and I didn't make it up, but I read it all and I talked to all the journalists who wrote all the stuff on my show about it. So, there's plenty there. But you turn on TV and it's just claim after claim after claim after claim. No attempt to even explain what they mean, much less prove that it's true. This guy killed 1,000 Americans. I don't know. Who even knows what he's talking about? Is he saying that 500 is 1,000? And that every time a Shiite in Iraq killed an American, that was Iran that did it? Is that what he's saying? And based on the EFP myth? Because that sure is a giant pile of garbage in order to make a claim seem right. But they don't even explain what they're talking about, half the time. And it's just accepted after all. You're talking about killing people. You think that they would do that if they didn't have to? You think that they would ever do anything that they don't have to do? Of course not. This is all heroic. The only question is just how heroic is it?
All right, Scott. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about, the major developments that we had in Iraq and, really, all the probably, unfolding events that are to come, between the U.S. and Iran and Iraqi politics. And hopefully now, have a little bit better of an understanding of it. That way, if you do end up watching the mainstream media, you'll have a little bit of an idea of what's going on. But before we go, talk about what's going on over at the Libertarian Institute, big matching funds donation.
Yeah, and I'm sorry because I just looked at the time and I really got to go. But yes, we got right at the end of the year, we got somebody pledged up to $20,000 worth of matching funds, but it's only good on a time limit of just this week. I think it expires next Tuesday or Wednesday. So, whatever we can raise before next Tuesday or Wednesday will be matched. And we've had a pretty good little fund drive here. I'm really appreciative of everyone. I want to say thank you to everyone who's helped to support us and let people know that if you want to give a little more or maybe you were waiting to find out if there would be matching funds, now there are. So stop by libertarianinstitute.org/donate. That's me and Sheldon, Richmond, Pete Quinones, and the great Kyle Anzalone, all there working as hard as we can for freedom for you there at libertarianinstitute.org/donate.
All right.
And thank you,
Scott.
Kyle.
Thanks.